Well, it's always a little dangerous going after lunch and it being the last speaker. So I hope none of you fall asleep or anything. It's kind of that time of the day. I always get um, super tired around this time, but I am really honored to be able to be here today and come and speak with you guys at this conference. I actually graduated my undergrad from North Dakota State University, so it's really neat to be back here and um, yeah, just brings back a lot of memories and a lot of hard work that was put into starting my higher education career. Okay. So yeah, just a little bit more about myself. So my family and I, we come from the White Earth Indian Reservation in Minnesota. And I'm a licensed psychologist at Sanford Health. I'm also adjunct scientist for Sanford Research. And so a big part of what I do is trying to implement more trauma care throughout our state. We talked about it a little bit earlier. I work for what's called the Treatment Collaborative for Traumatized Youth. And it's a state funded program to really help provide better trauma care and trauma education, prevention, intervention services across our highly rural state for our kids. And really, what I do is I help with a lot of the projects, but the one that I direct and kind of hone in the most is the one that we focus on for treating trauma in our Indigenous communities in North Dakota. I'm a mother. You see, I just became a new mom this last year, so finding that whole work-life balance thing has been tricky. If any of you have any tips and tricks, please come tell me after this talk. But that's her up here at her first powwow last year at the UND powwow. And yeah, I'm a wife, I'm a daughter, I'm a relative, and I really just strive to be able to understand how to support people best and how to help them through really, really tough times to be able to see the success and the resilience in themselves. So, how many of you in here are storytellers? Yeah, just like 10 of you? That's it? You guys are all educators, right? You all are storytellers. You all tell a story in your classroom. You all share information that's based in science and education and literature, and you also put your own spin on it with your own life experiences, right? Yeah. What does a storyteller mean? Can some people shout out a little bit of what a storyteller means in education? What was that? An audience. Yeah, you need an audience to do it, right? hmm Anyone else? A story. You need a story to tell, right? Yeah. And for you guys, like, oh, yeah, enthusiasm. Absolutely. To be able to tell a story well and not bore people after lunch, you kind of have to have some enthusiasm, right? So these pictures up here for me tell a story. It tells my story, my family history, as it relates to our experience with the educational system. And I'm going to be using these pictures and kind of referencing back to these pictures throughout our talk today, our story that I'll be sharing with you. And it starts with my grandfather, Marv Sargent Sr. You can see him all the way up on the left-hand side there. It also talks about my aunt, my paternal aunt, who she's in two photos on the bottom, one with my grandparents, my grandma, my grandpa, and then one in an educational setting. The one up top is the little boy all the way to the right is my dad in his traditional regalia. And then the photo all the way over is me, my dad, and my niece. And each person in the story really shares a narrative of what it's like to endure trauma and how to recover and to be able to create resilience in their life in the educational system. One thing that we do when we are doing our presentations for Project Heal, which is just a special project within TCTY, is I have two other Native American psychologists that I'm really grateful to work with. They're amazing. One's from the Turtle Mountain area, and the other one's from up in Canada. And really, really go back to these what we call these Anishinaabe seven grandfather teachings. And it's a way that we live our life, and it's values that we try and uphold by. And so when I think about when I do these trainings and I come and talk with people from all sorts of backgrounds, is how can I make sure that the information that I'm giving you today is based in these teachings of truth, courage, respect, honesty, love, wisdom, and my favorite, and I think most important, humility. I only know what I know. I only have my story to share and my family's story. I know a little bit about psychology. I know a little bit about trauma from a, I guess, scientific and psychological standpoint. But these are um, these are my stories, and these are my values that I bring into each presentation because every one of you has your own story, and every one of you has your own values and your own teachings. And so mine's not the end all be all. It's just what I know. And hopefully that it'll inspire you to think about what are yours and what are ways that you're going to implement where you come from and your family story and your values into your work. So hopefully after today, you'll gain a little bit of understanding of what historical trauma and Indigenous communities look like. Understand the impact of that from a psychological standpoint, but also specifically related to the educational setting and the relationship that our Indigenous people have with their educational setting historically and currently. And then learning about those cultural knowledge and practices and how that's impacted our people in a more psychologically well and resilient way. And really, uh, I mean, the fourth objective really should be in each and every one of these is to have you guys think about how does this knowledge and information of the past, even though it's going to be really painful and there's going to be some tough stuff that we talk about in here. So just disclaimer, if any of you feel that this is triggering for you or it's causing some sort of reaction in you, you can step out at any time. It's not disrespectful. But how these stories that are painful yet really beautiful at the same time, how they can be used to help guide you or help provide perspective for you in a new way to continue to support your students. So just to go over what trauma is, we talk about, I guess, in when we talk about trauma or post-traumatic stress disorders of some sort, is a person has to go through what we call a traumatic event, which is a witnessed or experienced event that posed a real or perceived threat to that individual or someone close to that individual. So we kind of look at it in these four categories. So when I'm assessing a patient and they come into my office and I know there's a huge, history there and I'm trying to gather all that, I'm really trying to think about which category or categories do they fall into, right? Acute is more so an isolated traumatic event. Was it a car accident? Was it a one-time sexual assault? It was just kind of a one experience. It had a beginning and an end. Whereas chronic is multiple traumatic events over a long period of time, whether that's repeated physical abuse, sexual abuse from a non-caregiver, things of those sorts. But really today, what we're going to focus on is what we call complex trauma and historical trauma and intergenerational trauma. So complex being that there's multiple traumatic events and it's chronic, just like chronic. But what makes it different is that the traumatic events occurred because someone in a caregiving role chose to inflict those events or pain or suffering, abuse, neglect onto that child. And so it really creates that early attachment issues, neglect, abuse, those kinds of things. And historical trauma being multi-generational trauma experienced by a specific cultural group, racial group, or ethnic group. So that may look like cultural genocide, boarding school era, slavery, things such as that. And so thinking about these things is how we're going to really look at how do these definitions start to play out and start to impact how people in terms of their behavioral impact, their emotional, their psychological, but then how it then creates distrust in their relationships as they get older. So this is just kind of an outline of post-traumatic stress disorder. So not everyone who goes through a traumatic event is going to get post-traumatic stress disorder, but really what we're looking for is when we're looking for symptoms. We want to know, is that person still re-experiencing in their mind or their body the things that had happened when that trauma happened, long after the trauma's done. That creates this sense of avoidance, right? Our body doesn't like to be re-experienced for very long. Our body's smart. It's going to find a way to try to minimize the distress of that re-experiencing as quick as possible. So we do behavioral avoidance, cognitive avoidance, emotional avoidance to be able to escape that high anxiety state, which then just reinforces there's a sense of threat even when there's not. But complex trauma looks a little different and it gets a little bit more complex. We have all those things, but really what happens is when these kids, when they are continuously in environments that cause them harm, there is a real sense of threat. They're not safe. And it really creates this, what we call affect dysregulation, which is just inability to really regulate our emotions and cope. Well, then, right, when you're kind of that kid that's always, not coping really well, you're going off the handle or you're dissociating and zoned out all the time, people are going to perceive you a certain way, and then you're going to perceive them in a certain way. So it's going to cause this negative self-perception, which then causes those relationship problems. And this is really important to keep in mind because it plays out in adulthood, right? When you experience complex trauma as a kid, it's going to continue to impact you in adulthood if things aren't addressed or treated. Has anyone seen this before, this window of tolerance? No? Okay, good. Um, because if someone did, I would say you can explain it and not me, and I can take a break for a little bit. But I really like this because when I give my patients, both adults and kids, when I'm trying to help them understand or help their parents understand how their symptoms look, how does post-traumatic stress disorder play out? This is such a good representation of how that looks. And if you guys have any takeaway, I think that when you're working with certain students and you're noticing some of the hyperarousal symptoms or the hypoarousal, it's going to make a little bit of sense. So when you know there's a history there of trauma, what we do is we tend to see the window of tolerance as this is when you feel like you can deal with whatever is happening in your life. You're still going to feel stress and pressure. We can't escape that. There's going to be anxieties in our life, and they should be there. But it doesn't bother you too much. It's kind of that ideal place to be. And we all have a window of tolerance. But what happens is when you experience trauma, whether it's acute, chronic, complex, historical, our window of tolerance naturally shrinks. So what happens is when it shrinks, it doesn't take much to throw you off balance. And so it can throw you when something stressful happens. If you can't manage that, in a good timely manner, it's going to put you in hyperarousal or hypoarousal. Hypoarousal looking like anxiety, anger, out of control, being overwhelmed. Your body wants to fight, run away. It's not something you choose. It just takes over. When you're out of your window of tolerance, your like prefrontal cortex, which controls all the decision making, all of the ability to make smart choices goes out the window. The amygdala takes over, and that starts to put you in that kind of autopilot mode. Hypoarousal being sometimes we're so stressed, and how many of you do this? Where you're stressed, you're tired, you're overloaded, your body just zones out, and your mind zones out, and you numb out. You're spacey, your body shuts down. It's not something you choose, right? You're not trying to just not pay attention. Your body just does it on autopilot. And so kids who have been through traumatic events and have PTSD, and same with adults, is their window of tolerance shrinks. And so it doesn't take much to put them in either or. And so they're really not engaging in life, right? They're really not being mindful, being present, using their brain and their knowledge to really make those good decisions. And so that really leads into this some of this research that we've done through the National Child Traumatic Stress Network does so much research on how PTSD plays out in the educational systems. And a lot of these symptoms are kind of what we typically see in kids who have gone through PTSD. And so for you guys, I mean, is this something you guys have seen as educators and your students? Have you seen this? Yeah. And if you didn't know it was trauma, You didn't know they had a trauma history. What would that look like to you? What would you might assume about that kid or person? Disruptive. They're disruptive, right? Maybe like they're kind of doing it on purpose. I don't know, I thought that a few times with some kids in my room. What about like, yeah, lazy, disengaged? Yeah. Might think there might be some learning disorder going on or ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, right? And so when we think about these symptoms in the educational setting, it can start to look like a lot of different things if you don't know the history and you don't know the story behind that person. And so bringing it back to the pictures of my family, is I think every one of us in that picture has experienced some level of these symptoms in the educational setting. And most of them didn't really have an understanding, most of the teachers or most of the educators didn't really have an understanding of why these things were playing out in our life. And it can really create difficulties, right? If these are happening, then your teacher, your educator is going to disengage. They're going to have a certain perception of you. And so it's really setting you up to not really get to where you want to be with your goals. So moving into this intergenerational trauma impact on relationships and historical trauma impact. When we talk about intergenerational trauma, what we mean is it's trauma that's kind of been passed down from generation to generation because of learned behavior, but also genetics. There's been a ton of research out there that has been looking at just kind of studying how does genetics play a role in passing down some of these genes and how can we separate it from what it's learned versus it's just like we just kind of inherit it when we're born. And really, what it looks at is being able to think about how it's then going to play out in your adult relationships and your childhood relationships. And so we know that it tends to create this negative belief on ourselves, others in the world. It creates these hardships in our psychological themes of safety, trust, power, control, intimacy, esteem, which causes the attachment issues. We parent how we were parented, even when we know it was wrong. We lack models of normative or positive parenting, and that disruption in the relationship between a caregiver and a child, then that's difficult for that child to trust others and develop healthy relationships in the future. So I think about that, right? When you have a family that's gone through intergenerational trauma because of historical trauma, it's just kind of at that point natural to um, have this lack of trust and safety with other people in the world because the harm that's been done, that's your normative. That's what you believe is typical. And so I think about that in terms of some of the kids that I treat, the parents that I treat, and how do we acknowledge that this is how the system kind of comes into play and how it pans out when we think about building those relationships and trust with our students. Just another more broader view from like a psychosocial standpoint. Really, right, intergenerational trauma is that passing of psychological and physiological traits from one generation to the next, and causes include poverty, injury, attack, domestic violence, poor care, mental illness, historical events such as colonization, genocide, slavery, things of those nature. And so you can kind of see how those adverse community events and the roots of the tree really pan out as adverse childhood experiences. These kids who are born into this are set up to experience these things at a much higher rate. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the ACE study, ACEs. Yep. I feel like educators nowadays are much more well versed in that. And so that kind of represents that, but from a community standpoint. And so thinking about why do some stressful events traumatize some and not others? And there's some research that looks at this. And I think more recently, in the past, probably 10 years, specifically with our Indigenous populations. But we know that in trauma work and trauma care, actually resilience is the more common reaction to stress than post-traumatic stress disorder. Resilience is the rule and psychopathology is the exception. But factors that intensify that stressful experience, the physical intensity of the experience or experiences, so complex trauma, right? That's going to kind of You're going to be, when you experience complex trauma and you're born into it, that physical intensity is going to be happening a lot more because it's happening all the time. Level of predictability and controllability. If you have low predictability and low controllability of what's happened or how you respond to that, that's going to cause a lot more psychopathology and symptoms that are occurring. And then those predisposition factors, which is genetic, previous life experiences and family experiences. But something that they've really looked into is this phenomenon of even if a child doesn't have supportive caregivers in the home, they at least just need one supportive adult in their life. And I would even say for like not even just children, but late teenagers, those 18, 19, 20-year-old launchers, I still consider them teenagers because their brains function as so. And so, if they at least just have one person that they find is supportive or understands them or is encourages them, that can actually really, really help recover from that traumatic event and that psychological impact. And we're going to come to that later in the talk. And so I just want you to keep that in mind. So moving into more of the educational impacts of historical trauma, and I'm only specifically talking about our Indigenous communities today. I know that there's a lot of other groups that have experienced historical trauma, and it looks a little different. It might play out a little bit different. So, like I said, this is just the knowledge I know from my professional and my personal life, from science, and from my family stories and teachings. So this comes from the Minnesota Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives Office. They did a really good job at kind of demonstrating and laying out what are some, not all, some of the different events that has happened over time to our Indigenous populations in the United States. And so, as you can see, there's a lot of different things that have happened, different acts, different treaties that have been put into place that were not meant to help our Indigenous communities, but meant to harm or meant to dismantle to be able to try and get rid of the population. And so you can see there's a huge missing between 1492 and 1871 because there was a lot that happened in between. I just don't have a big enough PowerPoint to put all that on there or time. But really for today, we're going to focus on the boarding school and reservation era because I think that that is something that connects with all of us because it really does give a lens and a perspective of why sometimes these students struggle in higher education or in the educational systems. Okay, so who knows or who has gotten training or gone to talks that talks about Indian boarding schools in the United States? Okay, quite a bit. Yeah. And I mean, today really, gosh, there's so much to know. What I'm explaining today just doesn't even like touch on everything. It just kind of starts to talk about it from a psychological perspective. And so I encourage you today, those of you that don't know much, continue to educate yourself, continue to learn, because it really, there's so many stories that need to be told about it. And so unfortunately, I don't have the time to do it justice, nor do I have all the knowledge to do it justice. But this is just my family story and what I know about our experience. So this is actually a picture from the Carlisle Indian boarding school in I believe it opened in the 1870s, and I believe this was taken in the early 1900s. And so really, the mission of Indian boarding schools was from the U.S. government, and their mission was to, take kids from the reservations, take Native American children, and to put them in these boarding schools. And the mission, what they advertised was, we want to kill the Indian and save the man. We want to civilize these Indians. We want to westernize them. We want them to be suitable for the times that we're living in. And so these kids were taken from their homes, or their parents were willing to give them to the homes, thinking that they were going to have a better life, they were going to have better opportunity, right? If my child can just go to school like every other person, they might have opportunity to be successful and get us out of poverty and those kinds of things. But that's not what happened. What happened was a lot of abuse, sexual and physical, psychological, neglect, physical, emotional. And there was death, murder. And I think that really when you think about, that's just one aspect of what Indigenous communities have went through, but it was a really significant one when it comes to our relationship with trusting the education system. Um, and so not only were these kids, went through all this abuse from the people that were supposed to be taking care of them, which was their teachers, their educators, the nuns and the priests. But they also were told that where they came from was bad, was evil, that their identity and their culture was no good. It would not serve them well, and it's not good to identify as being Indigenous or Indian or whatever they wanted to label that as. And so you can see how at a young age, if a 4 or 5 year old and some as young as 3 were taken, they grew up a majority of their early childhood and late childhood believing that about themselves. And so how that's going to continue to foster the intergenerational trauma. My grandparents were boarding school survivors, and both of them on my dad's side. And they didn't talk about it much, and I don't blame them. There's a lot of avoidance there and a lot of shame that happened. But I think about what they endured in school, and I think about how that what had happened to them and them not knowing how to be parented in a psychologically safe way, how to be cared for in a psychologically safe way, how that's passed down to my dad and how that's passed down to me and so on. And so when people say, well, Emily, like this happened, you know, 60s and 70s, it ended. Well, there's still the generational impact from the next few generations that are occurring. And one thing that we talk a little bit about as well as with the Indian boarding school era is that, you take these kids and you put them back in their home community. Well, their whole community is traumatized. No one knows how to parent. No one knows how to show love and care in the way that they used to. Construct of our community of how we did operate, how we caretaked for children, how we caretaked for our elders was gone. We didn't have those traditional ways and structure of how to go about doing those things. And we didn't have our traditional healing tools of how we knew how to recover from trauma because those were taken from us. They were told we could not engage in those things or bad things would happen to us. We would be punished. We would be abused, those things. And so I think about my grandfather and I think about how, in the first part of his adult life, he really had to reject being Indian to be able to survive, to be able to continue on and try and give his family some sort of good life, and how then that's passed down and passed down and passed down. So that shame in your identity and where you come from. So it's not just the physical and sexual abuse, it's the identity piece. And I think towards my grandfather, the later part of his life, he had said that when he did start kind of opening up a little about it, he'd said, it wasn't the physical abuse or the stuff that I witnessed happen to other kids that was the hardest. For him, it was being told where I came from and my story of my family and how I looked, which I had no control over, was bad and wrong. That I was going to hell for even just being Indian. That to him was the most impactful that had happened to him from those schools. And so, how does that look from the educational system now with our Indigenous students? Um, right? When you have gone to a school or your grandparents or parents have gone to a school where so much harm and neglect has happened, you're naturally going to come out of there not trusting educational systems, right? They don't have your best interest in mind, they cause harm. So that's going to create that poor relationship with educators and other helping professions. That continued oppression that still happens today. That's going to impact our Native students' ability to have that self-agency and that strong kind of belief in their identity and feeling proud in their identity and those things. A lot of the kids that I work with, they don't see hope that they're going to have anything better than where they came from or what they're experiencing right now or what their families experience. They can't see that they have the power to make the change, to have a different relationship with the educational system. They're going to anticipate anticipate and receiving low support. So they're going to anticipate that, but then they also do receive it. They don't maybe receive as much supports as their non-native peers. And then that leads to reinforcement of distrust. No one wants to help me. No one wants to see me succeed. Then the higher dropout rates. We have some of the highest dropout rates. I think I know in North Dakota, I think we're the highest in terms of the second race in terms of like when you look at the breakdown of it. And so those higher dropout rates really lead to those lower rates of attending higher education, right? When you're not graduating high school, you're not going to be able to go to college. Um, and so just by kind of thinking about this boarding school era where the intention that was told was, no, it's to give these kids and these families a better life, it actually did the quite opposite. And so going back to our stories of my dad and my aunt and my grandfather, I think about how each of us have had a story of how we have had distrust with the educational system. My dad, he and my mom got pregnant when they were 15 with my brother. They were both living in poverty and didn't have much resources. But my dad went to a school counselor one day, and he went to a public school on the reservation. So most of the teachers were white, and not native. And he said to her, you know, Lynn and I really, Lynn's my mom, we really want to go and get higher education. We really want to go to college. No one in our family has done that. We need to do that for our son. And the school counselor laughed at him and said, you know, you just don't have the grades, you don't have the resources. You're better off just staying put on the reservation like every other Indian kid. And could you imagine what that feels like to finally say, I'm going to break the generational pattern and I'm going to try to have better for my family, and then to be told that? How really that just reinforces everything that we just talked about, right? I think about my aunt. My aunt had two children before the age of 16. It was the same thing. School counselor said, you're better off staying on the reservation and really caretaking for your two boys. You're not going to be able to go to college with two kids. It's just not going to work. And how those stories and those experiences then get passed on to their kids. Don't trust the educational system. They don't have the best interest in mind. There's only certain people you can trust. You can't trust everyone. Not everyone wants you to succeed. So those things, right? Those mentality and those mindsets get passed down all through one incidence of historical trauma. With myself, I struggled in school a lot. We moved around a lot as kids, and so because of I think of that historical trauma, I have more of an anxious temperament, and I had a hard time paying attention in school. I think because of those traumas that had happened in our lives. And I just didn't get good grades. I didn't have good test scores. And I remember we had some speaker come, and she was great. She was a psychologist in town. And I remember after leaving that talk, I was like, wow, I think I want to be a psychologist. Like, I think that's what I want to do. I really relate to that. I click to that. I think that you could help so many people. And I remember going to my school counselor a few months later because we were thinking about applying for schools. And I said, well, what I really want to do is I'd like to go get, I'd like to be a psychologist. She goes, Emily, do you know like how much schooling that is? And I said, no, what is it? Well, you're gonna have to go get a PhD. And I just don't think with your test scores and your GPA, I don't know if that's the best fit for you. Now, do I think that school counselor was malicious and she was racist and she, like she knew what she was doing? No, she didn't know. She didn't know my family's history. She didn't know the story or the relationship we had with the educational system. But it certainly was a situation in my mind that stuck with me. You're right, I can't do it. You're right, I'm not smart enough to do those things. People from my family don't go on to get higher education, or if they do, it's not going to go beyond 4 years. And so those stories are really things that I know it's not just something my family experienced, but a lot of other Native students who have gone on to higher education have. Um, and I think that uh, when we think about the psychological and educational impacts of historical trauma, and we think about all the things that have happened to these students, it's really sad and it's heavy and it's not fun stuff to talk about. And I think sometimes, especially when I come to these talks and we talk about this, I'm often like, oh gosh, like I can't wait till we get to this part because what do you do with all that information that I just gave you, right? All this icky stuff, all this really disheartening and discouraging stuff that has happened to our people. Like, what do you guys do with that? And that's the piece that I want to highlight today is each and every one of you have that ability to really embrace each of your students' own story and own resilience. And not just your Indigenous students, any student that comes from an underserved community, that is maybe a first generation college student, that comes from a minority background, is these are the beautiful things that although they have gone through such atrocious traumas in their life and such pain, loss, um, and trauma, that all of these things still show up in their lives despite everything. And I think that so I love this picture because all these different concepts have been studied. There's been a lot of in the last I'd say 15 years, a lot more work on Indigenous resilience and what that means, and how do we start to all these like different socio and economic disparities that happen, psychological disparities in our communities. How do we work past that? Like, where do we go from there? And so all of these different traits and things is what really helps people have more of a resilient mindset so that they can take action to do what they need to do to better their lives and have a healthier life. Um, and so I think about going back to my grandfather, and he didn't let those experiences in boarding school. He didn't let them deter what he wanted to do. Sure, there was hardships. Sure, there was some things that continued to happen that probably weren't healthy, that caused more abuse and more pain into our families' lives. But really wanted to do the best they could with what they had. He went on to be actually our tribal chairman for several years, and he was lucky enough to go back and attend some college courses at Bemidji State. And it was then he had a professor he worked with that really was the first time he had a really great experience with someone in the educational system that told him, you can go on and do these things. You're a phenomenal writer. You have the ability to go and speak and to connect with people. You should think about running for chairman. He did. And I think about how he didn't let that experience deter him in any way, and he kept going. And he believed in, although education has caused a lot of pain, the educational system has caused a lot of pain in our community and in his life, he wanted to be able to make sure that that wasn't going to be everyone's experience and that there are people out there that want to support you and see you succeed. And so through that, he was able to kind of have this initiative on our reservation where education was really his platform, and that having our Native kids go on to higher education, go to college was really important, and that we invest funds and we invest our time in that from our community. And I think about how that impacted my dad. We were fortunate enough that we had at least one person in our family throughout that supported the idea of higher education. I think if my parents didn't, it might have looked a little different for me. I might not have pushed myself to go beyond what that school counselor said. So I'm very privileged in that not everyone from my community has a supportive person in their home that wants them to go on and do those things. Um, for a lot of different reasons. And so, but I think about my dad, how it took his college football or his high school football coach to, tell him, no, you can go on, you can do it. You and Lynn can do this, and you can create a good life, and you can get a higher education, and so that your family can be a little better than where you came from. And I think about for me, it was actually when I came here to NDSU where I got encouraged by one of my professors in the psych department to apply for the McNair Scholars Program. And I just remember looking at that program, and I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, a part of it here in this room, know of McNair Scholars? Yeah. Well, when you look at that application and you see all the stuff you have to do for it and you see everything, it's really daunting on top of doing all your college classes. But I went and I met with the director at the time. Her name was Anna Shepard, and it was the first time I had seen a Native American woman in higher education. I really am thankful for that relationship because if it wasn't for her pushing me and the other colleagues she had pushing me to show me that no, you can go on and do education, you can go on and get your doctorate, it's possible. I don't think that this would be here and I would be doing this today. And so it's really cool to be back here and to have that full circle moment for me. But it's those people and that's those educators in our life that really made a difference for us. So there's educators that can deter us and that can create roadblocks for us, whether they intend to or not. And then there's those who create paths for us, who encourage us, who grab a seat at the table for us, who embrace where we come from and they see it as a strength and not something that's going to hold us back. And those are the things that I carry with me when I talk about what it takes to really work through those traumas and how to work through those things so that you can get to your goals. And so I want to just kind of end with this activity. I want us to go back to the I want us to go back to the seven grandfather teachings that we talked about earlier of truth, courage, respect, honesty, love, and wisdom, humility. And what I want you guys to do for, let's say, 10 minutes or like 8 minutes or so. I want you at your group to, and I don't know if this is what keynote speakers normally do. This is what I do because I'm more of an interactive person. I actually don't like being up on stage. I'd rather be like walking around with you guys. But I want you guys to just really think about how do each of these values, these seven grandfather teachings that where I come from that are really important to success and that create resilience in our life, how do those show up in your educational roles? How can you as educators take each of these values and put an action to it? When we talk about acceptance and commitment therapy, it's a evidence-based cognitive behavioral therapy. It's kind of our third wave therapy that we do, and it really talks about when people have values and they know what their values are, and they're living out those values in their actions and their goals and how they're behaving with other people and themselves. There's going to be low psychological distress. But when people don't know their values, they're not sure of their values, or they know of their values, but they're not engaging in those values. Their behaviors are not reflecting that. It's going to cause turmoil. It's going to cause disruption in their relationships and their psychological well being. And so I want you guys to think about what is your value? And maybe it's something different than this, but what are the values you have or using some of these values up here? And how do you demonstrate that in your classroom? How do you demonstrate that as your role as an instructor in the university when it comes to your underserved or your minority kids who need that extra support? So I'm going to give you about 8 minutes and then we'll come back and end. That sounds good. All right. Let's come back together as a group. You're almost done. You almost survived the last 2 days, right? That's in the conference. Um, would anyone like to share? What did your group talk about? What were some things that you guys kind of came up with in terms of actions and behaviors? Okay. I really like that. That's one way we have to live out. We have to have the tough conversations sometimes, while also at the same time doing it in a way that has love to it and has that encouragement to help them be able to really do what they need to set their mind to, right? Who I know someone else had their hand raised in the back. Yeah. Oh,
We just had very clear expectations with nothing hidden. So making sure like you are grading according to your rubric in that it's very clear and upfront in advance how everybody will be evaluated and you're not hiding it from it's transparent.
Thanks a lot. It was a great presentation. So I would say as an educator, I would focus more on respect. If you respect your students, they will respect you back. And at the same time, you have to love your students and you get the same love in return. With love comes wisdom. You can learn from your students and they can learn from you. And definitely you have to be humble as a person. Otherwise, there will be, and if you show arrogance, life will treat you very badly. That's what I believe in karma. Karma hits you back. Thanks.
We were just talking, and we're across a couple different generations at this table, but many of us, even the younger group at this table, are talking about, I would say it's almost like humility, honesty, and courage come together to be self-reflexive and think about how when we were students, college level students, we didn't have many of the things that are also detracting from our students now. So I taught at a tribal college before here, so everything you're saying hits home really hard. But across all students, including this, like you showed at the beginning, there's all sorts of different traumas that people can be experiencing. But one of our big realizations is like, how do we teach and create in ways that we're not teaching the same way that we learned when we were undergraduates and like for example, several of us were talking about different things, or maybe their parents were academics, and so the focus was like, well, this is your, you get to get out of this chore, or my parents said you can't work because your number one job is being a student, or different things like that, whereas now our students are working two jobs and uh, being the breadwinner for a variety of people in the household and things like that. And so it takes a combination of those to be self-reflexive about our experience and how we translate that into how we teach.
I think as you're describing some of the signs and behaviors, I've had these like, "Oh," but and I've and students that I've had that I see these things happening and I may try to help or offer to help or think of of contacting, I'm always worried about how do I offer them help without singling them out, without embarrassing them, without insulting them. Um, and I guess we we really crave training on figuring out how to connect with them and how to offer them help without seeming that we are in a being in a negative kind of way. So
Yep. Um, I appreciate all of you sharing your wisdom and your opinion and your experience as educators on how you live out kind of these different values. And yes, you're correct. You can't have one without the other. And I think that's the beautiful part of our culture is, where I come from and a lot of other Native American tribes is that everything's connected. You can't just have one thing isolated on its own. They're all reinforcing. They're all creating an impact. So you can't have truth without courage, respect, honesty, love, wisdom, humility, all of those things. And I think that we have this ability as adult role models in these kids' lives to be able to support them, to be able to help them figure out what's next for themselves. And we're going to mess up along the way. We're not always going to do things right and correct. I think the PhDs and higher level of education and us, we like to be perfectionistic. That tends to be a little bit more of our personality types, and we want to do the right thing. We don't want to cause any more harm, but that's part of being a human being and having humility is learning along the way and figuring out what works and what doesn't work for some students. So I appreciate you sharing that and being able to open up about how this might play out in a classroom setting. I want to go back to these pictures as we finish today. I told you the story of my grandfather. I told you the story of my dad, myself, and I want us to go back to I didn't touch on the two other females in my life, and my aunt is the person in the middle as the professional photo. So she ended up going on to be a teacher, and she did go on to college despite what the counselor told her, and she taught on a reservation for many many years, and about 10-15 years ago she went back and got her master's in higher education and just really is when I think about a resilient Indigenous woman who, if she listened to every person that told her no, no, that's not a good fit. No, I don't think that's what's best for you. She wouldn't have had the life that she had for her family and herself. And then I think about the my niece who that was a few years ago at our powwow, and that was the first time she was able to dance in my jingle dress. And she's had quite a bit of a difficult life. She lost her mom to addiction a few years ago when she was a freshman in high school. And I think about kids struggling nowadays and when they've come from historical trauma and they've also endured the trauma happening in their current life is thinking about, man, how are they going to see through and how are they going to know that if you can just go to some higher education for some, and for some that's not for all, but if that's what you want to do, there's life beyond you past this trauma and this pain and this hurt. And so she actually is graduating next week and she'll be attending Colorado State next year. And so I just really like to highlight these stories of my family because, and it's a lot of people's families, right? Despite what has been done in the past and our relationship historically with the educational system and those that worked for the educational system, through resilience, through that supportive person, having at least one supportive person that believes in you, that you are able to persist, you're able to move forward, and you're able to not fall back on what the original intent of the boarding school was, which is to keep you silent, to keep you from improving, to keep you from healing your people. And so I think about my family story and so many other people's family stories, and maybe some of your families in here, and how that continues to live out in your family history and how it's going to continue to live out in your students in your classroom. So I appreciate you guys very much. Miigwech, thank you.
I'm just curious what your perspective is on many of my former students who have experienced all of this firsthand, etc., and want to break the cycle. They said we're tired of hearing about being resilient. We're tired. So what would be a response, a caring response to that?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question because I think it goes back to what the person in the back said about, like, I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to reinforce these things. And I think the therapist in me would say to validate that experience. They're tired, they're exhausted. They don't want to have to be resilient anymore. It's hard work. It's hard work digging yourself out of a hole. And so I think that a response that can kind of encompass all of those teachings we just talked about, especially humility and love, is to be able to validate them. I can understand why you're tired. That makes sense why you're tired. What can I say or what can I do for you in this moment to help support you? What's one thing we can focus on that I have the ability to support you today? So I think it's validating that. And because it is tiring, but the goal is that eventually they don't get stuck in that and they're able to persist little by little every day. Yeah, yeah. Well, you're going to test my reflection skills as a therapist here because I'm going to try to I'm going to try to summarize what you said because you said it very beautifully. But yeah, right. Like, how do we help students um, and make students have inclusion versus isolation? Because a lot of these students who come from historical and intergenerational trauma maybe are used to the isolation. So how do we continue to provide encouragement? Provide them a space to be able to get them from the C student to the A student, and that it's going to take little by little. It's not just going to happen overnight, just like the things that happened to them didn't happen overnight. And so I appreciate your wisdom and your perspective on that. I hope I summarized it the best I could, but we have time for one more question. You guys are a room full of educators. You know what it's like to stand up here and look at your students and be like, any questions, and none. No. Well, I appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for allowing me to be here, and I appreciate everything that you do for the students at this university. So thank you.